I'm Kate Seeley, Vice President of the Middle East Institute. We'll be examining Russia's support of the Assad regime in the face of mounting international pressure and criticism. To date, Russia has vetoed 2 draft Security Council resolutions in the past 5 months seeking to hold Assad accountable and support a political transition. The Russians say they're opposed to what they call geopolitical engineering. And in the meantime, as we see, the deaths are mounting, the chaos is mounting, and yet the Russians appear as committed as ever to backing the Assad horse with the support of the Chinese. And today, Mark Katz is going to be examining the many calculations that the Russians are considering. When I lived I actually had the privilege of living in Syria as a young girl in the 80s. My father was in the embassy, and at that time, Hafez al-Assad had many, of course, Russian military advisors who used to drive around, not in Ladas, but in white Range Rovers, which made them very easy targets for the Muslim Brotherhood, which was, of course, waging a rebellion against the regime at the time. And several were killed. Mark and I were talking about this today. We don't know how many. The Russians never disclosed the numbers, but it's fascinating that 30 years later, these 2 allies are still together, facing down together a somewhat similar threat, possibly referring to the same playbook, and certainly sharing the same history. United, well, not just in their isolation, but in this shared history as well. So it's a deep and complex relationship, and one that we're very much looking forward to understanding better today. Mark Katz has been examining Russia's relations with the Middle East for many years now. He's a professor of government and politics at George Mason University, and has been working on this topic for about, for 30 years. He's the author of Leaving Without Losing, The War on Terror After Iraq and Afghanistan, Reflections on Revolutions, Revolutions and Revolutionary Waves, and Russia and Arabia, Soviet Foreign Policy Toward the Arabian Peninsula, among others. He has a website, markkatz.com, where you can read more of his articles and find out more about his books. We're very honored and pleased to have him here today to fill us in on this very unique relationship. Please join me in welcoming Mark Katz.
Well, I'd like to thank Kate Seeley so very, very much for inviting me yet again to come speak at the Middle East Institute, which I think is a truly wonderful place, and I'm so glad that so many of you are here. And certainly the relationship between Moscow and Damascus, has gone back a long, long time. And we are now seeing the Russians, very strongly acting to defend the Assad regime. And I want to talk about why that might be. But before I do that, I want to say something about the history of the Syrian-Russian relationship. We certainly read in current press accounts about how strong the alliance has been between Russia and Syria, that Syria, is the last Russian ally in the Middle East. But to tell you the truth, the relationship between Russia and Syria going back to the 1950s has never been an easy one. There's always been problems in this relationship. That it first became close in the 1950s, especially with the rise of the Ba'ath regime. And it seemed that, what happened was that the Ba'ath, anti-Western, anti-Israeli, when they first came to power, they came to power in cooperation with the Syrian Communist Party. That Moscow seemed to have hopes that the Syrian Communist Party would at minimum share power with the Ba'ath indefinitely, if not take power. But of course the Ba'ath had other ideas, and it seems that part of the motive for joining Nasser in the United Arab Republic was to get Nasser's assistance in crushing the Syrian Communist Party, which he did very, very effectively. Then, of course, once he had done that and the United Arab Republic broke up again in 1961, Russia reestablished relations with Syria, but for the next decade or basically, the Soviet-Syrian relationship played second fiddle to the Soviet-Egyptian relationship. Egypt was the main Soviet ally in the region, where there were an even larger Soviet troop presence of Soviet naval bases in Egypt, and basically Egypt, which is usually at odds with Syria during this period. Russia certainly didn't do anything to side with Syria against Egypt. Now, the relationship got closer in the 1970s after the Egyptians expelled the Soviets. Then Syria's importance to Russia increased dramatically, and certainly with the Soviets being able to make use of the naval facility at Tartus, which is something that was very important for their Mediterranean fleet. But even then, there were still problems between Moscow and Damascus. It was one of the things that the Syrians complained about bitterly was that the Soviets did not provide the same quality of weaponry to Syria that the Americans supplied to Israel. And in the many clashes between Syrian and Israeli forces that took place, especially in Lebanon, Israel usually getting the best of it, Syria blamed Moscow. The Soviets made it clear that there was nothing wrong with the quality of their weaponry. It was the quality of the people who were operating them that was an issue. So that was an issue, in other words, that sort of they constantly chafed at this. In addition, the Soviets had very good relations with Iraq. Well, maybe not very good. As good as was possible, I suppose, with Saddam Hussein, which, of course, Syria and Iraq didn't get along at all. And so this was also a thorn in the side of the Soviet-Syrian relationship. And then things, one important difference was that while the Soviet Union, no matter how opposed to Israeli policy it may have been, has always recognized Israel as having a right to exist, whereas Syria has usually not been in this particular camp. And so Syria did not even cooperate with Soviet Middle East peace efforts for the most part. In other words, this was something that Syria was not particularly interested in. The relationship got cooler when Gorbachev came to power, especially as his administration started pursuing a new thinking, as they called it, in foreign policy. As Gorbachev improved relations with America and the West, improved relations with the moderate Arab governments, improved relations even with Israel, the Soviet-Syrian relationship took a back seat. And then in the 1990s, it basically fell into a torpor. In other words, that under Yeltsin in particular, there was very little content to the Russian-Syrian relationship. The Russian Navy even stopped using the facilities at Tartus. Russian Navy has had a hard time operating at all. Whereas in the United States, of the three services, the Navy may be sort of first among equals. In Russia, the Navy has always gotten a back seat compared to the Army and usually some of the other services as well. And so the Russian-Syrian relationship basically was in abeyance. When Putin came to office at the very end of 1999, he became president in his own right in 2000, he set about to reassert Russia's influence in much of the world where it had retreated, especially the Middle East, tried to revive the Russian-Syrian relationship. But it didn't revive at first. It took until about 2005. One of the things that Putin seemed to be quite serious about was collecting the debt that Moscow claims Syria owed to Moscow from the Soviet era, that this was, something on the order of $12 to $13 billion, that the Syrians, as so many Russian allies of the past, were sure that they didn't know anything near that much amount of money. And this was a real issue for Putin, at least for a while. Now, the relationship did improve in 2005. It seems that it was at this time when the U.S. still seemed to be doing well, not only in Afghanistan, but even in Iraq. And there was talk about, what country would we liberate next? Would it be Iran? Would it be Syria? And of course, there was the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon. Syrian troops withdrew from Lebanon. And the question was, would there be intervention? And this seems to have drawn the Russians and the Syrians together. The debt issue, they more or less got around basically on Syria's terms. I think the Russians wrote off something like 75% of the face value, and the rest, was converted into investments in Syrian industry, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, Russia did gain certain things, and that is that Syria might not have paid for past Soviet weapons, but they were now buying Russian weapons and actually paying for them. The Russian Navy started to renew its use of Tartus, and the Russian oil company Tatneft acquired interests in the Syrian petroleum sphere. So that's on the positive ledger. But on the negative ledger, some of the same old issues still seem to dog them, and that is that the Russians would sell weapons to Syria, but not the advanced weapons that the Syrians wanted, and that they seem to be holding off, not just at the behest of the United States, but at the behest of Israel. And this is one of the interesting aspects, I think, of Putin's Middle East policy that I think is often not understood in the U.S., but that under Putin in particular, Russian-Israeli relations have grown extremely close. And that especially with the conservative Israelis in particular, that there is a great deal of security cooperation between Russia and Israel. Trade relationship has boomed, that the addition of Israeli technology makes Russian arms sales to certain customers, particularly India, possible. I don't know that they'd even happen without this addition. They really aren't Russian arms sales. They're Russian/Israeli arms sales to India. And so all of this is, the Syrians have noticed and have been unhappy about. So, even if Assad crushed his enemies and they never rise again, it's very doubtful that Russian-Syrian relations going forward would be smooth and easy. In other words, that there have been so many issues between them in the past that it's very likely that they would rise again. In other words, Syria has not been an easy ally for Russia in the least. So why, then, is Moscow defending it so staunchly now? What are its motives? Now, one can certainly point to, well, they would lose, if Assad falls, they'd lose the arms sales, they'd lose Tartus, they'd lose the oil interests. But certainly, members of the Syrian National Council whom I've spoken to have indicated that they have been in talks with the Russians and have sought to reassure them that, in fact, they would like to, continue close Russian-Syrian cooperation. That, in other words, that all this is still possible if, if Russia wants and if it would stop supporting Assad so closely. Now, maybe, one might doubt their promises, especially now that their ranks seem to be divided. But in other words, it seems to me that it would behoove Moscow to be a little more neutral in this. In other words, since it's not clear who is going to be the future government of Syria, why not hedge one's bets? In other words, so that whoever is in power, they can get along with. Why put all their eggs in the Assad basket, if you will, when doing so could be quite costly to them. And I don't think, in our terms, certainly the value of the arms sales is just peanuts, from our terms. And they have lots of, oil interests as well. In other words, that the Syrian oil is not exactly going to, to make them. So what is it? And it seems to me that there are three three areas in particular that help explain Russian motives. And first and foremost is that the Russians really think